town of Brimford was an ordinary small town, nestled between forested hills and winding country roads. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Yet, despite its cozy facade, there was one secret that had remained buried for decades: the abandoned pharmacy on Sycamore Street. Once a bustling center of the community, the old pharmacy had been the heart of Brimford. Children would rush in after school for penny candies, and their parents would chat with the friendly pharmacist, Mr. Isaac, while picking up prescriptions. It was a warm, welcoming place until the fire. One night, nearly 40 years ago, a mysterious blaze had engulfed the building. Mr. Isaac, the only one inside, was never seen again. His body was never recovered, and the townspeople could only speculate about what had happened. Since then, the pharmacy had stood as a blackened husk, untouched by time. No one dared to tear it down, and no one wanted to rebuild on that cursed ground. Over the years, strange stories began to circulate. Some claimed they could see lights flickering inside the building late at night. Others swore they heard voices calling out from the charred walls. But no one could explain the eerie chill that crept up their spine whenever they passed by. Max Turner had always been the town troublemaker. At 16, he prided himself on never backing down from a challenge, no matter how dangerous or foolhardy it might be. So when his friends dared him to spend the night inside the abandoned pharmacy, he accepted without hesitation. "You're seriously gonna do it?" asked Jake, his best friend, as they stood in front of the pharmacy late one Friday evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dilapidated building. "Of course I am," Max replied, his voice full of bravado. "It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Jake shrugged, his face pale. "I don't know, man. My grandma said something really messed up happened in there. People hear things, voices and stuff. It's not normal." Max smirked. "Your grandma also thinks the moon landing was fake. Look, I'll be fine. I'll spend the night, take some pictures to prove it, and you can all buy me lunch for a week." The group of boys laughed, but there was an underlying tension in the air. They had all grown up hearing the stories about the pharmacy, passed down like whispered legends. The fire, the disappearance of Mr. Isaac, and the strange occurrences since then were a part of the town's history, a dark corner everyone avoided. Max shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and walked toward the front door of the pharmacy. The air felt colder as he approached, and a gust of wind sent a shiver down his spine. The wooden door was scorched and cracked, its edges blackened from the flames that had destroyed the interior all those years ago. He pushed against it, and it groaned on its rusted hinges before swinging open. Inside, the pharmacy was frozen in time. Shelves that once held medicine and supplies were empty and coated with dust. The counter where Mr. Isaac had stood was charred, but eerily intact. Faded labels still clung to the walls, their words unreadable beneath layers of grime. Max took out his phone and snapped a few photos, sending them to his friends. "See? Nothing to worry about," he muttered to himself, though the silence around him was thick and unsettling. He walked deeper into the building, his footsteps echoing off the walls. The deeper he ventured into the pharmacy, the stronger the feeling of unease became. There was something wrong with the air. It felt heavy, like a presence was pressing down on him. Max shook off the feeling, reminding himself that it was just an old abandoned building. But as he rounded a corner and entered what had once been the back storage room, he froze. Standing in the center of the room was a figure. Max's heart leaped into his throat, and he blinked, certain that his eyes were playing tricks on him. But the figure remained. It was a man, tall, thin, and dressed in a soot-covered pharmacist's coat. His face was obscured in shadow, but Max could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and penetrating. Who's there?" Max stammered, backing up slowly. The figure didn't move, but the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Max could see his breath now, fogging in the cold air. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang, and he spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. When he turned back, the figure was gone. Panicked, Max fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. He tried to call Jake, but the screen flickered and went black. The battery had drained in an instant despite being fully charged moments ago. His pulse quickened as he realized that the stories, those ridiculous, far-fetched stories might not have been so far-fetched after all. Max rushed to the door, but no matter how hard he pulled, it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the wood, screaming for help, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence that had settled over the pharmacy. A faint whisper reached his ears, and he stopped, listening in horror as it grew louder. It was a voice, no, multiple voices, speaking in low, indecipherable tones. They were all around him now, surrounding him, growing louder with each passing second. The sound was maddening, a cacophony of whispers that clawed at his mind. He stumbled back, covering his ears, but it did nothing to block out the noise. And then, the voices stopped. In the dead silence, Max heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing through the empty pharmacy. He turned toward the source of the sound, his body frozen in terror. The figure was back, standing in the doorway to the storage room. This time, Max could see his face, gaunt, pale, and burned, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through him. "Get out," the figure whispered, its voice like the crackling of flames. Max didn't need to be told twice. He bolted toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he reached for the handle, he was yanked backward by an unseen force. He hit the floor hard, gasping for breath as icy fingers seemed to wrap around his ankles, pulling him deeper into the darkness. "No!" he screamed, clawing at the floorboards, but it was no use. The cold grip tightened, dragging him inch by inch toward the shadowy figure. The last thing Max saw before everything went black was the twisted, burning face of the man who had once been Mr. Isaac, staring down at him with a malevolent grin. Max was never seen again. His friends searched for him the next morning, but the pharmacy was as silent and empty as ever. The door was still locked, and there were no signs that anyone had entered. The only clue was Max's phone, lying just outside the door, its battery drained to zero. The town of Brimford moved on, as towns do, but the legend of the abandoned pharmacy grew darker with time. Some nights, when the wind howled through the streets and the moon hung low in the sky, people swore they could hear screams coming from inside the charred building. And if you stood close enough to the door, you might even catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure, waiting in the darkness. But no one dared to enter. No one, except for Max. And he never came back. Evergreen Hollow was a small, sleepy town nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move slower, where life was quiet and people lived without many surprises. But like many small towns, Evergreen Hollow had its own dark secret, a legend passed down through generations, whispered among locals at dusk or over drinks in the town's only bar. The legend of the ghost train. Years ago, when the town was still growing, a railway was built to connect Evergreen Hollow to the bustling city beyond the mountains. The townsfolk welcomed the train line, which brought travelers and goods, and for a time it seemed like Evergreen Hollow was on the verge of prosperity. But then, one fateful night, everything changed. The story went that in the late summer of 1923, a train left the city bound for Evergreen Hollow. It was a foggy night, with the moon obscured by thick clouds. The train never arrived. The conductor, the crew, and all the passengers on board vanished without a trace. No wreckage was found, no bodies recovered, and the tracks were in perfect condition. The authorities searched for weeks, but it was as if the train had simply disappeared into thin air. The railway was eventually closed, but the townspeople never forgot. Strange things began to happen soon after the train's disappearance. Late at night, especially on foggy evenings, people claimed they could hear the faint sound of a train whistle echoing through the hills. Some even reported seeing the ghostly outline of a train, its windows glowing with an eerie light, speeding along the abandoned tracks before vanishing into the mist. On the night of October 13th, 3 friends, Tom, Sarah, and Nick, decided to put the legend to the test. It had been years since anyone had tried to investigate the ghost train, but curiosity got the better of them. They'd grown up hearing the stories from their grandparents, but like many young people, they didn't believe a word of it. To them, it was just a fun excuse for a spooky adventure. "Come on, it'll be fun," Tom said, as the three of them made their way down the overgrown path toward the old railway. Besides, it's Friday the 13th. What better night to find a ghost? Sarah rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. You guys know this is just a dumb story, right? There's no ghost train, it's just an old legend. Nick, always the cautious one, glanced nervously around the darkened woods. Yeah, but what if it's not? What if something really did happen? Tom laughed and clapped him on the back. Relax, Nick. If there's any ghost train out here, I'll be sure to get it on camera. They reached the old railway tracks just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. The tracks, rusted and half buried beneath years of dirt and vegetation, stretched out into the distance, disappearing into the fog that had begun to roll in from the mountains. The air was unnaturally still. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves, seemed muted, as if the world was holding its breath. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. Okay, so what's the plan? We just sit here and wait for a ghost train? Tom grinned. Pretty much. I say we hang out for a while, see if we hear or see anything. If not, we can call it a night and say we tried. They set up camp near the tracks, lighting a small lantern for warmth and light. Hours passed in relative silence, the three of them making small talk to pass the time. As the fog thickened, their laughter faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Nick checked his watch. It's almost midnight. You guys ready to call it? Just as he spoke, a faint sound echoed through the air, a distant, mournful whistle. The three friends froze. Did you hear that? Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. Tom sat up straighter, straining to listen. It's probably just the wind or something. But the sound came again, louder this time, a long, low whistle, unmistakably the sound of a train. Nick jumped to his feet, his face pale. That's impossible. There hasn't been a train on these tracks in decades. Tom, trying to maintain his bravado, grabbed his flashlight and aimed it down the tracks. Maybe there's an old train coming through. You know, one of those restoration projects or something. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The tracks were unusable, overgrown and broken in places. There was no way any real train could be moving on them. As they stood in stunned silence, the whistle sounded again, closer now. And then in the distance, they saw it, a light, faint at first, but growing brighter. It flickered through the fog, casting long shadows across the trees. It was the unmistakable headlight of a train, cutting through the darkness like a knife. The three friends watched in horror as the light drew nearer, revealing the outline of an old-fashioned steam locomotive. Its black body shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and its windows were lit with a soft golden light. Through the windows, they could make out the shapes of passengers, men, women, and children, all sitting in eerie stillness, their faces blank and lifeless. The train glided silently along the tracks, its wheels moving without a sound. As it passed by the friends, Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. One of the passengers, a woman in a pale dress, turned her head slowly to look at them. Her eyes were hollow, empty, and her lips twisted into a smile that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The train continued to glide past them, its whistle sounding once more as it vanished into the fog, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The friends stood frozen, too stunned to move, their hearts pounding in their chests. What the hell was that?" Nick finally whispered, his voice trembling. Tom shook his head, his bravado gone. I don't know. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she forced herself to speak. We need to leave now. They gathered their things in a hurry, stumbling over the uneven ground as they rushed back toward town. No one spoke, the weight of what they had just witnessed too heavy to process. When they finally reached Evergreen Hollow, the streets were quiet, the town asleep and oblivious to the terror they had just experienced. The friends parted ways in silence, each of them haunted by the memory of the ghost train and the empty faces of its passengers. In the days that followed, the three of them tried to move on, to convince themselves that what they had seen was just a trick of the fog, a hallucination brought on by fear and imagination. But the nightmares persisted, dreams of the train, of its passengers, of the woman with the hollow eyes and the twisted smile. It wasn't long before word of their experience spread through the town. Some people believed them, adding their story to the growing legend of the ghost train. Others dismissed it as nonsense, the product of overactive imaginations. But late at night, when the fog rolled in and the moon was hidden behind clouds, the people of Evergreen Hollow couldn't help but listen for the distant, mournful whistle of a train that was never supposed to return. There's a story whispered among the townspeople of Crestfall, the kind of tale that's passed around at campfires and late-night gatherings, but never spoken of during the day. It's the story of Ashwood Lane, the road that vanishes with the dawn. Some say it's just an urban legend, a cautionary tale to scare kids into staying inside after dark. But others, those who've lost loved ones to it, know better. Ashwood Lane is no ordinary road. It doesn't appear on any map, and no one can pinpoint exactly where it is. They say it appears only at night, nestled between the familiar streets of the town, its entrance shrouded in mist. If you stumble upon it, you'll see an unassuming street lined with flickering lampposts and ancient trees stretching into the shadows. But those who step onto Ashwood Lane are never seen again. And by morning, the street is gone, leaving behind no trace of where it had been. Marissa had heard the stories growing up, like everyone else in Crestfall. As a child, she found them thrilling, but easily dismissed. Yet, as she grew older, the tales began to unsettle her more deeply. Over the years, people from Crestfall had gone missing, dozens of them, vanishing without a trace. Her own older brother, Alex, had been one of them. It had been 5 years since that night. Alex had gone out for a walk after an argument with their parents, never to return. The police searched for weeks, but no clues were ever found. It was as if he had simply disappeared off the face of the earth. Marissa was only 13 at the time, but she remembered the ache of loss and the heavy silence that settled over their home after he was gone. She also remembered the hushed whispers of neighbors who spoke of Ashwood Lane and wondered if that was where Alex had gone. The idea had haunted her for years. Now, at 18, Marissa was determined to find out the truth. She needed closure, even if that meant confronting the impossible. It was a cold, clear night when Marissa set out on her search. The town of Crestfall was quiet, the streets empty, save for the occasional glow of a porch light or the hum of a distant car. She had no clear plan, just a desperate hope that somehow Ashwood Lane would reveal itself to her. Her feet carried her through the familiar streets of Crestfall, but there was an unfamiliar tension in the air. As midnight approached, a thick fog began to roll in, settling like a heavy blanket over the town. Marissa's heart quickened. She had read about the fog in the old stories, how it always preceded the appearance of the street. Her eyes darted around, scanning every road and alleyway, and then, just ahead, she saw it. A street she had never noticed before, tucked between two houses that seemed to lean unnaturally toward it. The street was narrow and lined with tall, twisted trees whose branches arched overhead like skeletal fingers. The lampposts lining the road flickered dimly, casting long shadows that danced along the pavement. Her breath caught in her throat. This had to be it. Ashwood Lane. Marissa hesitated at the entrance, the weight of the stories pressing down on her. People who entered this street never came back. But she had to know what happened to Alex. Her entire life had been consumed by the not knowing, by the gnawing sense that something had been left unresolved. Steeling herself, Marissa stepped onto the street. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken around her, muffling the sounds of the town behind her. As she walked further in, she felt a strange sense of disorientation, as though the world around her was subtly shifting. The street seemed to stretch longer than it should have, and the trees loomed higher. It was deathly quiet. No wind rustled the leaves, no crickets chirped. The only sound was the soft crunch of her boots on the damp pavement. Every instinct in her body told her to turn back, but she pushed forward, her mind fixed on Alex. About halfway down the street, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A figure was standing beneath one of the flickering lampposts, half obscured by the fog. Marissa stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her ears. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, its face hidden by the shadow of a hood. "Hello?" Marissa called out, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move at all. She took a cautious step forward, and then another, the fog swirling around her as she approached. As she drew closer, the figure's features came into view. It was Alex. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and distant, but it was undeniably him. Marissa's breath caught in her throat as tears welled in her eyes. "Alex!" she cried, rushing toward him. But as soon as she reached out, her hand passed through him. Alex dissolved into the fog, his form dissipating like smoke. Marissa stumbled back, her mind reeling. What had she just seen? Was it really him, or some kind of cruel illusion? Before she could process what had happened, she heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming from the darkness at the end of the street. Marissa's heart raced as she turned to look. Emerging from the fog was another figure, but this one was different. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to move in unnatural angles. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel its gaze locked onto her. Fear surged through her, and she turned to run. But no matter how fast she ran, the street seemed to stretch on endlessly before her. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like claws, and the fog thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud. Her breaths came in ragged gasps as she sprinted toward the entrance of the street. But when she reached the spot where she had entered, she found nothing but more road. The street had shifted, its entrance now gone, trapping her within its maze-like grip. Panic set in. She was lost. The stories had been true. Ashwood Lane was a trap, a road that never let its victims escape. Her thoughts raced as she tried to remember the way she had come, but everything looked the same, distorted by the fog and the flickering light of the lampposts. The footsteps were closer now, echoing ominously in the stillness. Marissa glanced over her shoulder and saw the tall figure gaining on her. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as though it had all the time in the world. In a desperate move, Marissa darted into the trees, hoping to lose the creature in the dense foliage. But the trees were no sanctuary. Their twisted branches seemed to reach out to her, snagging her clothes and slowing her escape. The fog was thicker here, so dense she could barely see her own hands in front of her. And then she saw it. An old house, hidden among the trees, its roof sagging and its windows dark. It was the only sign of shelter she had seen, and though every part of her screamed to avoid it, she had no other choice. She sprinted toward the house, her legs burning with exhaustion. The front door creaked open as she approached, as if it had been expecting her. Without a second thought, Marissa dashed inside and slammed the door behind her. She leaned against it, her chest heaving, as she listened for the footsteps outside. Silence. For a moment, she dared to hope that she had escaped. But then, the house began to change. The walls groaned, shifting and warping before her eyes. The floorboards creaked under invisible weight, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Marissa backed away from the door, her heart hammering in her chest. From the shadows, she heard a whisper, a soft, eerie voice that seemed to come from all around her. "Welcome home." The tall figure appeared in the doorway, its shadow stretching across the floor. Marissa's legs gave out beneath her as she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with fear. And as the darkness closed in around her, she realized the truth. No one ever returned from Ashwood Lane, and now neither would she. The small town of Hollowbrook was nestled between thick forests and rolling hills, the kind of place where everyone knew each other and life was slow and steady. The woods, vast and ancient, wrapped around the town like an unspoken boundary, a line the townsfolk rarely crossed. Children were taught from an early age not to venture too far into the trees, not to wander where the sunlight didn't reach. And though no one could explain why with certainty, the locals all knew the reason for their collective caution. The Watcher. It wasn't something openly discussed. The stories of the Watcher in the woods were passed down quietly, whispered among friends and families late at night. There were no clear descriptions of the creature. No one had ever seen it fully, not up close. But everyone knew the feeling, that strange sensation of being watched, the prickling at the back of your neck when you stood too close to the edge of the forest. The Watcher didn't chase or attack. It simply observed, lurking just beyond the trees, always watching, but never seen. At least, that's how the legend went. Marian had lived in Hollowbrook her entire life. She had grown up hearing the same stories as everyone else, and while they had always unnerved her, she never fully believed them. It was easy to pass off strange sounds in the woods as animals or the wind, and the feeling of being watched could be chalked up to overactive imaginations. After all, it was just a story. But after what happened to Jack Turner, even Marian found it hard to dismiss the legend so easily. Jack was a local handyman, always fixing things around town and helping out with odd jobs. He wasn't the type to scare easily. He spent most of his days outdoors, working in and around the woods. But one evening, he came back from a job looking pale and shaken, something no one had ever seen before. He refused to talk about what had happened, brushing off questions with nervous laughter, but word got around. Jack had been fixing a fence along the edge of the woods when he'd seen something lurking in the shadows just beyond the trees. He hadn't been able to make out what it was, but he said it didn't move like any animal he knew. He felt its eyes on him, cold and unsettling, and despite his size and strength, fear had gripped him like never before. Not long after that, Jack left Hollowbrook. No one knew where he went, but people said he couldn't stand the feeling of being watched anymore. Marian thought about Jack often as she walked through town, particularly when she had to pass near the woods. The trees seemed darker these days, the air heavier, though she knew it was probably just her imagination. Still, the stories had taken root in her mind in a way they never had before. It was late autumn when Marian found herself walking home after dark, the sun having dipped below the horizon much faster than she expected. The air was crisp and the leaves crunched beneath her feet as she hurried along the narrow path that bordered the woods. She had always taken this route. It was the quickest way back to her house, but tonight it felt different. The woods seemed to press in on her, the trees casting long, twisted shadows across the path. The wind rustled through the branches, making the leaves dance, but there was something else, a silence, thick and unnatural, that settled over the woods like a blanket. No birds, no insects, no animals stirred. Marian quickened her pace, her breath puffing in the cold air. She tried to focus on the ground ahead, on the lights of her house just visible in the distance. But no matter how hard she tried to shake it, the feeling crept in, the sensation of being watched. Her skin prickled, and a chill ran down her spine. She glanced toward the tree line, her heart pounding. Nothing moved. The woods were still dark and impenetrable, but she knew better. Something was there. It was watching. Her pulse quickened as she forced herself to keep walking, her eyes darting nervously from the path to the trees. The shadows seemed to shift and twist, as if something was lurking just beyond her line of sight. She felt the weight of its gaze, cold and heavy, but whenever she looked directly into the forest, there was nothing. Just darkness. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. "It's just your imagination." But deep down, she wasn't so sure. The wind picked up, carrying with it a strange, low sound, like a whisper carried on the breeze. Marian stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. She strained to listen, her breath shallow. The sound came again, barely audible, like the soft rustling of leaves but more deliberate. It was coming from the woods. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. And then she saw it. A pair of glowing eyes just beyond the trees, watching her. They were faint at first, like distant lanterns, but as she stared, they grew brighter, more defined. The creature was too far into the shadows for her to make out its shape, but those eyes, cold, unblinking, and utterly inhuman, were fixed on her. Marian's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she was frozen in place. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They simply watched. Finally, her body responded. She turned and ran, her feet pounding the path as fast as they could carry her. The wind howled in her ears, and the trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing longer and darker. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. She just ran, her heart racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she reached her house, she slammed the door behind her, locking it with trembling hands. She stood there for a long time, her back pressed against the door, trying to steady her breathing. Outside, the wind howled and the trees rustled in the dark. For days after, Marion couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Even inside her own home, the sensation lingered. She kept the curtains drawn and avoided going near the woods, but no matter what she did, she couldn't escape it. She felt the watcher's presence, always just beyond her vision, lurking in the shadows. One night, as she sat in her living room, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. The old stories echoed in her mind. The watcher never fully showed itself, never attacked, but it was always there, always watching. And then from the corner of her eye she saw it again, those glowing eyes staring at her through the window. The watcher had found her, and this time it wasn't going to stay hidden. The town of Coldwater was like any other small, isolated community. Its streets were quiet, its people were friendly but private, and it held more than its fair share of secrets. Tucked between thick forests and winding roads, Coldwater had a strange quirk, something that visitors found odd but rarely questioned for long. There were no dogs. It wasn't something that was openly discussed, but anyone who lived there knew the rule. No one in Coldwater owned a dog. There were no barking yards, no leashes hung by the doors, and not a single paw print in the streets. No one would admit why, but the absence of dogs was not by choice. It was a rule older than the town itself, a curse passed down from generation to generation. It started with the founding of Coldwater over a century ago. Back then, the settlers were just a group of hopefuls, looking to build a new life far from the bustling cities. They built their homes, cleared the land, and tried to carve out a place for themselves. But there was something they didn't understand about the land they had claimed. The dogs were the first to sense it. It had been a long time since anyone in Coldwater had dared to own a dog. The last family who tried had been the Millers, about 20 years ago. They had brought home a sweet golden retriever puppy, their daughter Emily's birthday present. The whole town held its breath when they saw the little dog wagging its tail, blissfully unaware of the doom it had brought with it. For a few days, nothing happened. The Millers seemed happy, and their puppy became the talk of the town. But then, strange things began to happen. At first, it was small, subtle things. The air grew colder, especially at night, far colder than it should have been for that time of year. Shadows in the woods seemed to move, darker and more unnatural than before. The dog, once playful and curious, became withdrawn and anxious, whimpering at nothing and refusing to leave the house. And then the death started. Marion had heard the stories growing up, just like everyone else in Coldwater. The tales of what happened to the Millers and the others before them were enough to keep her from ever considering getting a dog, no matter how much she wanted one. The curse was real, everyone said. Anyone who brought a dog into Coldwater was asking for tragedy. Emily Miller's father had been the first to die. He had gone out one evening to chop wood and never came back. They found him the next morning lying dead in the yard, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. No one could explain what had happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no wounds, just that look of horror etched into his features. A week later, Emily's mother followed. She had been in perfect health, but one morning she simply didn't wake up. The doctors couldn't find a cause, and the townsfolk knew better than to ask. Emily, too young to understand the curse, was sent to live with relatives far from Coldwater, her puppy taken with her. The town fell into a heavy silence after that. No one spoke of the curse openly, but everyone knew dogs brought death to Coldwater. The curse was as old as the town, and it wasn't one to be broken. For years, the town remained dogless, and life returned to its usual quiet routine. That is, until the arrival of a newcomer, a man named Peter Renner. He was a city boy, looking for peace and quiet after the noise of city life, and Coldwater seemed like the perfect place. He bought a small house on the edge of town, close to the woods, and settled in quickly. The townsfolk welcomed him politely, but they didn't go out of their way to get close to him. Outsiders never stayed long in Coldwater. A month after Peter moved in, he did something that sent a ripple of dread through the town. He brought home a dog. It was a scrappy little terrier, full of energy and mischief. Peter had no idea about the town's history. No one had told him, and the townspeople, afraid to speak of the curse, didn't warn him. They just watched in anxious silence as the dog trotted happily at his heels. Marion couldn't shake the growing sense of unease as she watched Peter walk his dog down the street that morning. She had seen what happened to the Millers when she was just a child. Her parents had tried to shield her from it, but she remembered the fear in their eyes, the way the adults whispered when they thought the kids weren't listening. She wanted to warn Peter, but how could she explain the curse without sounding insane? Who would believe that owning a dog could bring death? The first sign of trouble came just days later. Marion was sitting on her porch when she noticed the change in the air. It was late September, but the wind had an unnatural chill to it, colder than it should have been. The sky was dark, even though it was still early in the afternoon, and the trees swayed as if something unseen was moving through them. Then came the howling. It wasn't the bark of Peter's terrier. This was something deeper, more guttural, like the sound of a beast prowling just out of sight. Marion's blood ran cold as the noise echoed through the town, growing louder with each passing minute. She wasn't the only one who heard it. Neighbors stepped outside, their faces pale and drawn, listening with dread. That night, Peter's dog disappeared. He searched everywhere, calling out its name, but there was no sign of the little terrier. The town knew what had happened. The curse had claimed the dog. Peter's fate was sealed. 3 days later, it happened. Peter was found dead in his house, his body cold and lifeless, just like Emily's father years before. There were no marks on him, no sign of violence, but his face was twisted in the same expression of terror that had haunted the Miller family. The town knew the curse had claimed another victim. After Peter's death, the air around Coldwater seemed to lighten. The unnatural chill faded, the shadows in the woods returned to normal, and the strange howling stopped. The curse had been satisfied, for now. The people of Coldwater went back to their quiet lives, careful to avoid the subject of dogs and the fate of anyone who dared to defy the curse. Visitors came and went, but no one ever stayed long. The town remained dogless, as it had for generations, its curse a silent shadow that loomed over the residents. Marion, like everyone else, kept her distance from the woods and from the dark history that lay buried beneath Coldwater's serene surface. She knew better than to question the curse, better than to tempt fate. The town with no dogs would stay that way, because in Coldwater, owning a dog wasn't just forbidden, it was fatal. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.